Hello everyone, welcome to Easy Science YouTube channel. So in the previous class we have studied about the microsporogenesis and megasporogenesis, that is formation of male gametes and female gametes. The next process is, like already we discussed in sexual reproduction in organisms, that is after the formation of gametes and movement of gametes, this all comes under pre-fertilization changes. So later we have fertilization, right? So in case of the seed plants, there is a special process called pollination. Before going for fertilization, there is a special process takes place which we call it as pollination. So let's discuss about pollination in today's class. So before going to the class, please subscribe to Easy Science YouTube channel and click the bell icon. You will never miss an update from my channel. Let's move to our class today, pollination, right? So what is the reason why this special process was occurring only in case of the seed plants? The reason is, in sexually reproducing organism, any of the gamete, that is, one of the gamete is motile and the other gamete is non-motile. So generally in sexually reproducing organisms, the male gametes are motile and very small and the female gametes are non-motile. But in the case of the seed plants, both the female gametes are non-motile. So for fertilization, in pre-fertilization events, we already discussed that the gametes has to come close together in order to initiate fertilization. So as both the male gametes and female gametes are non-motile, a special process takes place in order to bring the male gametes near the female gametes. And this phenomena we called it as pollination. In case of the seed plants, this phenomena we called it as pollination, right? So let's discuss about pollination in this class. Right. So what do you mean by pollination? What is the exact definition of pollination? Means the mechanism of transfer of pollen grains which are shed. See, dehiscence of anthers, pollen grains will shed, right? So after maturity of the anther, so the transfer of pollen grains which are shed from the matured anther to the stigma of the pistil is known as pollination. So flowering plants have evolved amazing array of adaptations in order to achieve pollination. So to bring the male gamete near the female gamete, they have adapted, like they have evolved different adaptations. Plants have evolved many adaptations. So today we'll discuss all of them in our class, right? So already we discussed, see, this is the diagrammatic representation where the pollen grains, see if you observe the pollen grains, right? See here, the pollen grains are shed from the anther and they are falling on the stigma of the plant, and this phenomena we called it as pollination. So generally we have two types of pollination. One is self-pollination and the second one is cross-pollination. So what is self-pollination? We'll discuss. What is a cross-pollination? So this is a chart which was showing the total process of pollination. We have totally two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. In self-pollination, we have autogamy and geitonogamy, and in cross-pollination, it is dependent on plants and factors. On plants, like we have allogamy, hybridism, and based on factors we have anemophily, hydrophily, zoophily. That is, cross-pollination means some agent should be there to carry the pollen grains, that is wind, water and animals. There are three factors which can carry the pollen grains near the stigma. They are divided into biotic factors and abiotic factors. So this wind and water will comes under abiotic factors, and zoophily means the pollen grains are carried out by animals, and this is termed as biotic factors. These factors are called as biotic factors. So let us discuss in detail about all these. Right. Autogamy. Autogamy means this is one type of pollination where the transfer of pollen grains from anthers to the stigma takes place on the same flower, like between the same flowers. They are bisexual flowers. they are bisexual flowers. So both male and female gametes are present on the same flower. So the pollen grains which is shed from the matured anther will fall on the stigma of the same flower, and such pollination we called it as autogamy. But autogamy is very rare, because if autogamy has to take place, there should be a great synchrony between the anther and the stigma, that is between the pollen grains and the stigma, which is very difficult. And to achieve autogamy, anthers and stigma should present very close to each other. So because of these reasons, autogamy is very rare, because this is not happen every time. Synchrony will not be there. Both the male and female gametes will not be released at the same time. Sometimes pollen grains will mature little earlier when compared to the stigma, and stigma will mature little earlier when compared to the pollen grains. Then autogamy will not take place. They definitely go for cross pollination. So autogamy is very rare. Next, we have Viola, Oxalis and Pomenelia. These are the three examples where they produce generally two types of flowers. The two types of flowers are chasmogamous flowers and clistogamous flowers. So what is the difference between these two flowers? Chasmogamous flowers have very exposed anthers and stigma. So pollination will be very easy because the flowers are exposed, right? Well exposed anthers and stigma are present in chasmogamous flowers. But in case of the clistogamous flowers, the anthers and stigma do not open. See, they have to open. Digestion of anther takes place in order to release the pollen grains. Stigma has to, like the pollen grains has to shed on the stigma in order to germinate. But in case of the clistogamous flowers, they are not open. Both the anthers and stigma are not open. So if they open, maybe what pollination takes place, that depends on the factors, right? Actually, the anthers and the stigma are not open. So what happens is, see, fertilization has to take place, right? In order to continue its generation, it has to reproduce. So what the clistogamous flowers will do, the anthers and stigma are present very close to each other. As they are not like well exposed, they do not open, that's why both are present very close to each other in order to initiate self-pollination, right? So in clistogamous flowers, like most probably self-pollination takes place. Can you tell me what are the advantages and disadvantages of clistogamous flowers? See, clistogamous flowers always go for self-pollination. See, in the previous slide, I explained that self-pollination is very rare because between the pollen grains and the stigma, the synchrony is very less, and one more is they are not present close to each other. But in the case of clistogamous flowers, the anthers and the stigma do not open. So in order to facilitate the process of germination of pollen grains, they were present very close to each other. In order to initiate the process of pollination, they are present very close to each other. As they are present very close to each other, generally self-pollination occurs in case of the clistogamous flowers. So here I am asking, is there any advantage or disadvantage for clistogamous flowers to undergo self-pollination? Yes, in any process there are some advantages and some disadvantages also. So in case of the clistogamous flowers also, we have some advantage and we have some disadvantages. So what are they? Means advantage is, anyway pollination is taking place, right? So fertilization takes place, fruit formation will be there and seed formation will be there. Definitely there will be next generation for such flowers. That is one of the advantage of like present very close to each other in order to facilitate pollination. Right. What is the disadvantage is, as the pollination is self-pollination, you know what do you mean by self-pollination? Autogamy takes place. That is, the pollen grains of the these flowers are bisexual flowers. The pollen grains will fall on the stigma of the same flower. So this is called autogamy, self-pollination. The disadvantages are, see, variations are not produced because the fertilization takes place between the pollen grains and the stigma of the same flower. So variations are not possible. possible. You know, variations are necessary for the organism, living organism or living thing, to ensure better living in this environment. But that's not possible for clistogamous flowers because variations are not produced as pollination takes place between the pollen grains and the stigma of the same plant. So maybe some disadvantages are there, maybe advantages are there, but this is the only method of pollination in case of the clistogamous flowers. Chasmogamous flowers have well exposed anthers and stigma. So if they want to go for cross pollination, they can go for cross pollination also. But in the case of the clistogamous flowers, only self pollination is possible. Right. So this is the diagrammatic representation. Viola plant, see chasmogamous flowers which are above the ground and clistogamous flowers which are underground. This is a seed pod. This is which is formed after the autogamy. Right. So these are the two types of flowers. So we have chasmogamous flowers and clistogamous flowers. Clistogamous flowers only go for self-pollination. Right. So the next one is geitonogamy. Geitonogamy means the pollen grains of one flower will fall on the stigma of another flower which is present on the same plant. See, this is actually, it involves functionally it's a cross pollination because the pollen grains are falling on the stigma of the another flower, but the flower also present on the same plant. That's why geitonogamy is functionally we call it as a cross pollination, but genetically it is similar because both the flowers are present on the same plant. Right. See, autogamy means the pollen grains will fall on the stigma of the same flower. Only on one flower this takes place. But geitonogamy, the transfer of pollen grains from one flower to the stigma of another flower, but both the flowers are present on the same plant. Right. So geitonogamy is functionally cross-pollination because it occurs between two different flowers. But actually, genetically it is similar because both the flowers are present on the same plant. So possibility of variations is very less in case of the geitonogamy. Right. So see, this is self-pollination. This is on the same flower, pollen grains will fall on the stigma. So geitonogamous pollination, this is the same plant where two flowers are present, where pollen grains of one flower will fall on the stigma of the another flower. So this is geitonogamy. Cross pollination. So the next one is cross pollination. We also called it as xenogamy, or it also called as allogamy also. Is also called as allogamy. That means the pollen grains from anthers to the stigma of different plants. See, this is one plant and this is one plant. So pollen grains from the flower of one plant will fall on the stigma of another plant. So that we called it as xenogamy, or it is also called as allogamy. So this is the only type of pollination, xenogamy or allogamy, which we call it as cross pollination, is the only pollination, only one type of pollination which brings genetically different types of pollen grains to the stigma during pollination, because it was happens between the flowers of different plants. That's why there is a possibility of bringing genetically different types of pollen grains to the stigma during population, which definitely leads to variations, helps the plant to survive better in this changing environment. Right. Right. So self-pollination, cross-pollination, it is autogamy. We have geitonogamy also, and cross-pollination. So in order to take place cross-pollination, some agents are required. Without agents, cross-pollination do not take place. You know, male gametes are non-motile, so some agents has to be there in order to carry the male gametes near the female gametes. So the agents are divided into two types, abiotic factors and biotic factors. So the abiotic agents are wind and water. If it is carried by wind, the pollen grains are carried by wind, it is called as anemophily. And if the pollen grains are carried by the water, it is called hydrophily. And we have different biotic agencies. Agents are present. Like biotic agents means animals carry pollen grains to the stigma, and this phenomena we called it as, and these agents we called it as biotic agents. And we have different types of agents here I have given. If the pollen grains are carried by beetle, it is known as cantharophily. If it is carried by beetle, it is called cantharophily. And if it is carried by moths, phalinophily, right? And it is carried by bees, it is called melitophily. And butterflies, it is psychophily. And snails, it is called malcophily. And birds, ornithophily. Bats, chiropterophily, and by ants it is myrmecophily. Ants it is myrmecophily, and with bats it is chiropterophily. Right. So these are the different types of biotic agents which help the pollen grains transfer of pollen grains, or which helps in the process of pollination. So let's discuss about the abiotic agents and biotic agents which helps in pollination. See, majority of the plants use biotic agents for pollination. Pollen grains come in contact with the stigma is the chance factor with abiotic agents. See, pollen grains which are carried by the abiotic agents, like they are coming in contact with the stigma is a chance factor. See, may happens, may not be happen, maybe happens or may not be happen. That's why to compensate these uncertainties and the loss of, see, lot of pollen grains will shed from the anthers, and but they cannot be carried near the stigma. That means that is lost to the plant. So to compensate these uncertainties and loss of pollen grains, generally the flowers produce innumerable number of pollen grains in order to increase the chance of pollination. Right. So in case of the abiotic factors, we have two types of abiotic factors, that is water and wind. In this two, wind is the most common factor of abiotic. Wind is considered as the most common abiotic factor. So the pollen grains that are carried by wind has some special features in order to facilitate pollination by wind. The pollen grains which are carried by wind have some special features in order to facilitate pollination by wind. So what are the special features which are needed for the pollen grains? First point is they should be non-sticky, right? Otherwise they stick to some surface and cannot be carried by the wind. That's why the first very most point is they should be non-sticky and they should be very light in their weight in order to carry by the wind, because wind carries the substances which are light in their weight, right? And the pollen grains are well exposed stamens for easy dispersion by wind currents, and the stigma should be large and very feathery in order to stick the pollen grains to the stigma. See, if you observe the corn stigma, see, they are appear like silk threads where the pollination by wind is possible. Feathery stigma should be there so that the pollen grains will fall and stick to the feathery stigma which initiates pollination. So these are the some of the features of the pollen grains which are pollinated by wind. Right. See, feathery stigma should be there. Ensure the pollen grains to fall on the stigma and facilitate the process of pollination. Right. So that is about pollination by wind. And pollination by water is very rare. Only 30 genera have pollinated by water, and pollination by water is mostly present in monocotyledons. So water is the regular mode of transport of gametes, like male gametes, in lower plants such as algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes. So examples of like plants which carried like pollination carried by water are Hydrilla, Vallisneria and several marine grasses such as Zoostera. So these are the examples of the plants which carried by water. Vallisneria, Hydrilla and several marine grasses. See, all the aquatic plants do not, in all the aquatic plants, pollination do not occur by water. See, all aquatic plants do not use water for pollination. Majority of the aquatic plants like hyacinth, water lily, what happens is the flowers emerge. See, the plants are present inside the water, but flowers are emerged above the sea level of the water, and after like emerging above the sea level, the carried away. See, they are pollinated by either wind or insects, right? Vallisneria, in case of the Vallisneria, see, you know, Vallisneria, the pollination has done by water. Generally, the pollination was done by water only. So, the female flower reaches the surface by long stalk, and the male flowers or pollen grains are released into the surface of the water, and these pollen grains will be carried passively by water currents. See, this is Vallisneria. The flowers reach the surface of the water. Even the stamens will be on the surface of the water. So passively they are carried near the stigma by the water currents. See, Vallisneria, here we observe the example like which occurs water pollination, hydrophily. Water pollination is called as hydrophily. So, and this is about Vallisneria. And in sea grasses, the female flowers remain submerged in the water only. In case of Vallisneria, they will come to the surface of the female flowers are come to the surface of the water. But in case of the sea grasses, they remain submerged in the water only. Which one? Female flowers. The pollen grains are also released into water. They are passively carried by water. It takes place inside water only. But in case of the Vallisneria, takes place above the surface of the water. And in case of the sea grasses, takes place inside the water only. And in water pollinated species, generally in water pollinated species, the pollen grains are covered by mucilaginous covering. What is the reason why they are covered by mucilaginous covering? Means in order to protect the pollen grains from getting wetting. Otherwise, if they are present inside the water, they become wet and pollination does not take place. To avoid this, water pollinating pollen grains are covered with mucilaginous covering. It's a protective covering which ensure that pollen grains cannot be wet inside the water. Right. So this is about water lily, which form the flowers are above the water level. Right. So they pollinated by water lily means it's see, water lily. Wind or insects, right? It's an aquatic plant where see you can observe the insects here. Or else I'll write here insects. Right. Next one. So you know abiotic factors. Pollination by abiotic factors is maximum. Majority of the plants use a range of animals as pollinating agents. Animals, like among animals, you know, bees are the dominating biotic agents. Among all the animals, we have observed different types of pollinating agents in animals, in which bees are the most dominating biotic pollinating agents because they collect a large amount of nectar. In order to collect nectar, they visit different flowers. Right. So pollination by bees is very dominant when compared to the different animal species. This is the reason why they are dominating. They collect a large quantity of nectar. In order to collect, they visit different flowers and collect the nectar. While collecting the nectar, they help in pollination also. That's why bees are the dominating biotic pollinating agents. Flowers of animal pollinated plants, see, like the plants in which the flowers are pollinated by animals, they have to, like we observe there also, right? Wind, there are some special features for the pollen grains, right? Here, flowers will, see, which are the plants in which the flowers are pollinated by animals, the flowers will show some specific adaptations. In case of the pollination done by winds, the pollen grains will show some adaptations. The same thing here, the plants in which the flowers are pollinated by animals, the flowers will show some adaptation. The features of the flowers which help in animal pollination are flowers must be very large, right? And they should be very colorful, fragrant, and the fourth one is rich in nectar because animal visits the flowers for pollinations, like for nectar only. So in order to bring the animal visits, all these features should be there for the flowers. See, in case of the plants which are pollinated by wind or water, where the flowers do not show any special features, that like they will not be colorful, or they will not be fragrant, or they will not be rich in nectar, because that doesn't need, they are abiotic factors which doesn't need all of this, right? But animals are biotic factors which can identify everything. That's why flowers should show some features in order to facilitate pollination, right? The features of the flowers are, they must be very large in order to like observed by the animal through which pollination takes place, and they should be very colorful so that eye attraction will be there on that flower, and they should be fragrant, like gives you a very good smell, and the flowers should be very rich in nectar, because most of the plants visit, like most of the animals will visit the plants for nectar only. So these are the special features, right? So if for a plant, if small flowers are there which cannot be observed by the, cannot be visible by the animals, in such cases what the flowers will do is they form a small group, cluster, they cluster to form an inflorescence. So what is the reason for making this inflorescence? Inflorescence means the cluster of small flowers which make them conspicuous, like visible to the animal which carry this pollination. And animals are attracted by either color or fragrance. The flowers pollinated by flies and beetles, and these flowers will secrete some foul odors which attract these flies and beetles. Right. To sustain animal visits. Sustain means, see, one time the animal has visited this flower, and next time also the animal has to visit the same flower. Sustainability. Every time the animals has to come to the flower, near the flower. In order to sustain the animal visits, the flowers will reward the animals. All the flowers will reward the animals. See, flowers are showing some adaptations in order to attract the animals. And one more is, these flowers will reward the animals. Why they reward the animals? In order to sustain this animal visits. Every time the same animal has to come, because without animals pollination does not take place. That's why they will, in order to sustain the animal visits, right? So they reward the animals. So what reward they will give means, generally the reward is nectar and pollen grains are usual floral rewards. Nectar and pollen grains are the usual floral rewards. See, for harvesting the reward, see, to ensure or to take the reward, the animal visitor has to come in contact with the anthers and the stigma, right? So when the animal visit the flower, the body of the animals, for nectar it will come. So the body of the animal gets coated with the pollen grains, and when the animal gets in contact with the stigma, see, for nectar only it will reach another plant where stigma is present. So the anthers which are present on the pollen grains which are present on the animal will stick to the stigma, which ensures pollination, and the plant gets pollinated. Right. In some species, generally the nectar is a general reward, and in some species the floral rewards are providing safe place for laying eggs. Example, Amorphophallus, where the animals will lay eggs inside the flower. Relationship between moth and yucca plant. See, this is moth and yucca plant. If you observe, these are the moths and this is yucca plant. The moth will lay eggs in the locule in the ovary. Locule means what? It's a cavity, ovarian cavity, we called it as locule. It will lay eggs in that. See, we already observed in pre-fertilization changes like laying eggs. In a safe place they will lay eggs, right? So they lay eggs in the locule where safety is present. In turn the flower gets pollinated by moth. Such type of relationship where both the animals get benefited, we call that relationship as symbiotic relationship. That phenomena we called it as symbiotic relationship, where moth will get a safe place to lay its eggs, and yucca plant in turn gets pollinated by moth. So when the eggs are fully developed, the young ones hatches out, right? Here the larva will come out. When the larva will come out of the eggs, as the seeds start developing, after fertilization, like ovules develop into seeds, right? When seeds start developing, the larva of the moth will comes out of the locule. Locule is nothing but the ovarian cavity, right? Right. And majority of the flowers are hermaphrodites. That means both the male and female gametes are present on the same plant. So there are large chances for self-pollination as both the gametes are present on the same plant. See, pollen grains fall on the stigma of the same flower. It results in the self-pollination. But continuous self-pollination results in breeding depression for that plant. So, flowering plants develop many devices. See, in order to prevent this breeding depression, many flowering plants develop many devices to discourage self-pollination and encourage cross-pollination. And these devices we called it as outbreeding devices. See, every time majority of the plants are hermaphrodites, bisexual, both male and female gametes are present on the same flower. There are large chances. See, in the first slide only I explained it's very rare because synchrony will not be there. Like synchrony means what? Anthers and the stigma should mature at the same time in order to ensure self-pollination, and they should present very close to each other, which is not possible. That's why self-pollination is very rare. But in case of some plants, we know all the plants, like majority of the plants are bisexual. So there are lot of chances for self-pollination. So if every time self-pollination occurs, the plant like has a breeding depression. So in order to avoid this breeding depression, the flowering plants develop many devices to discourage the self-pollination and encourage cross-pollination. These devices we call it as outbreeding. Outbreeding devices. Outbreedings not, they are outbreeding devices. So the first one is either the anther or the stigma will mature earlier in order to prevent self-pollination. And the anthers and the stigma are present at different heights. See, we already know that they should be present very close to each other in order to self-pollination, right? So they are present at different places, and like we'll discuss that. See, protogyny. Protogyny means, see, the gynoecium matures earlier, but the anthers are not shedding the pollen grain. So definitely this flower will go for cross-pollination only, as the same flower anthers are not get mature. Right. Example, bluebell. Right. That we called it as protogyny. Pro earlier, gyne, that is gynoecium. Maturity of gynoecium takes place earlier when compared to the andrecium. Right, that is called protogyny. Next one, protandry. Proandry. Andrecium will be matured before gynoecium has maturity. The stigmas are not receptive, like they have to receive the pollen grains, right? That phenomena, like it doesn't reach that receptive stage where the stigma doesn't reach the receptive stage. So pollen grains will go and fall. See, you know that in like gametogenesis we observe that the pollen grains has to fall on the, and after maturity the anther dehiscence of anther takes place where the pollen grains are released. They have to shed on the stigma, right, before they lost their viability. So as the stigmas are not receptive, pollen grains will choose for another flower where the stigmas are receptive. So that definitely ensures cross-pollination only. That's why protogyny and protandry are the outbreeding devices. Right. Next one is heterostyly. Heterostyly means, see, here style was present at this height but stamens are here. But here stamens are in this flower, stamens are at this height but style it is here. So at different places style and stamens are present at different heights, so that self-pollination do not take place. So here this flower and this geitonogamy takes place, right? If it is on the same plant, geitonogamy takes place. That ensures cross-pollination. Example, jasmine, primrose, oxalis, lithysis, right? And self-incompatibility, that is when pollen grains fall on the stigma of the same flower, they will not germinate. The stigma does not allow the pollen grain to germinate. Genetically similar individuals are present, like the pollen grains of the same plant, like same flower, fall on the stigma of the same plant. The pollination do not takes place, like germination of the pollen grain do not takes place, and this is known as self incompatibility. See, we have two types of, like stigma has the capacity to identify whether the pollen grain is compatible or incompatible. This is known as self-incompatibility. Like compatibility is there, both have same species only, but the stigma does not allow the pollen grain to germinate in order to prevent the self-pollination. That's why this type of incompatibility we called it as self-incompatibility. Right. The next one is unisexuality. That is, female flower, the stigma was present on different flower and the stamens are present on the different flower. Definitely, as they do not have the pollen grains and here stigma is not there, these pollen grains should fall on the stigma of another flower. That is, if flowers are unisexual, definitely they go for cross pollination only. Example, maize, castor, mulberry, papaya, date palm. So these are some outbreeding devices where what is the like function of this outbreeding devices means they generally prevent self-pollination. What is the reason why self-pollination has to be prevented? The reason is, in case of every time if the flower was going for self-pollination, then it leads to breeding depression. In order to like prevent this breeding depression, generally the flowers will not allow self-pollination. They provide some devices, they adapt some devices in order to prevent this self-pollination, which we called it as outbreeding devices. Right. So, if male and female flowers on the same plant, male and female flowers are present on the same plant, it prevents autogamy. The flowers will prevent autogamy but not geitonogamy. That means the pollen grains can fall on the stigma of the different flower on the same plant. That can happen. Geitonogamy they cannot prevent, but they can prevent autogamy. If male and female flowers are present on the different plants, it prevents both autogamy and geitonogamy also. Right. So next, pollen pistil interaction. See, the pollen grain before fertilization, in order to facilitate fertilization, the pollen grain has to germinate. When it falls on the stigma, it germinates. What do you mean by germination of pollen grain? Pollen tube will form which reaches the micropylar end, where it releases the pollen, like male gametes inside the egg cell. So that is called germination. So there is some interaction between pollen and the stigma. Pollination does not guarantee right type of pollen grain should fall on the stigma. I already said in the previous slide, stigma has the capacity to understand whether the pollen grain is compatible or incompatible, like wrong type or right type. Compatible pollen grain is known as right type and incompatible pollen grain is known as wrong type. Very often pollen from other species or from the same plant land on the stigma. See, generally the pollen grains of other species will land on the stigma, or the pollen grains of the same flower or same plant will fall on the stigma, which is called, see, other species means it cannot germinate, and even same species means that will comes under, like same plant means that will comes under self-pollination. So the pistil has the ability to recognize whether the pollen grain is compatible or incompatible. If it's a right type, that is compatible pollen grain falls on the stigma, the pistil accepts the pollen and promotes the post-fertilization events, which leads to fertilization. Post-pollination events, it's not post-fertilization. If the pollen grain that falls on the stigma is a right type, then the pistil accept that pollen grain and initiate the post-pollination event. That is, after pollination, what has to be takes place. That will initiate it, which leads to fertilization. But if the wrong type of pollen grain falls on the pistil rejects the pollen grain and does not allow the pollen grains to germinate. Post-pollination event means germination of the pollen grain. Will not allow, prevents the germination of the pollen grain. So this ability of pistil to recognize the pollen grain is whether compatible or incompatible is due to how it takes place, how the pistil can recognize the pollen grain is a compatible one or non-compatible one. That is due to the dialogues between the pollen and the pistil, and this dialogue is due to a chemical interaction between the pollen and the pistil, right? So if the pollination like pollen grain is compatible, the pollen grain germinates on the stigma to produce. Germination is nothing but the producing pollen tube through one of the germ pore. You know, about like around the pollen grain we have two layers, exine and intine. Exine sporopollenin layer will be present. The sporopollenin layer is not present at germ pore through which pollen tube rises, and the contents of the pollen grain reaches the pollen tube. Now pollen tube grows through the tissues of the stigma, style and reaches the ovary, right? We already discussed that some of the pollen grains will shed in 2-cell stage or some of the pollen grains will shed in 3-cell stage. 2-cell stage means vegetative cell and generative cell will be there. 3-cell stage means the generative cell divides and give rise to 2 nucleus, right? So if the pollen grain shed in the 2-celled stage, the generative cell, like whenever pollen tube, germination of pollen tube, pollen grain takes place, at that time the generative cell divides and forms 2 male gametes during the growth of the pollen tube in the stigma. But if the pollen grain shed in the 3-cell stage, already the generative cell divides and gives rise to 2 male gametes, and the pollen tube carries the 2 male gametes from the beginning. But in case of the 2-celled stage, pollen grain shed in the 2-celled stage, 2 male gametes are formed during the growth of the pollen tube in the stigma. But in case of 3-celled stage, the pollen grain carries the male gametes at the beginning, like from the beginning only. So after reaching the ovary, what takes place? You know, ovary contains ovules, right? Ovule is present. Ovule has micropylar end and a chalazal end. Micropylar end has synergids and one egg cell. And like in chalazal end they have antipodals, right? So pollen tube after reaching the ovary enters the ovule through the micropyle and then enters to one of the synergids. You know, synergids are covered by the filiform apparatus which guide the pollen tube into the synergids. So all these events, pollen deposition, entry of pollen tubes, the pollen has fall on the stigma. Stigma like style pistil identified that it has compatible or incompatible pollen grain. If it's a compatible pollen grain, germination takes place. Right, pollen tube moves through stigma, style and reaches the ovary. From ovary it enters into the micropylar end, enters into the synergids through the filiform apparatus. All these events together we called it as pollen pistil interaction. All these events we called it as pollen pistil interaction. This is called pollen pistil interaction, right? So see, this is the mature pollen grain where this is a 3-celled stage, right? So sperm cells are there, pollen tube nucleus will be there, and this is the female gametophyte where we have this integuments are there, layers are there, and this is like chalazal end will be there and micropylar end will be there, right? So what happens is the pollen grains falls on the stigma. So whenever if it's a pollen grains are compatible, so they germinate and form the pollen tube and reaches the ovary and enters the ovule through the micropylar end, where it this is the ovary and this is the egg cell, where it moves to the egg cell, right? So pollen pistil interaction is a dynamic process, depends on the chemical interaction between the pollen and the pistil, which involves pollen recognition. If it is a compatible, it promotes pollination, or if it's an incompatible, it inhibits the germination of pollen grain. So this knowledge of pollen pistil interaction helps the plant breeder to manipulate pollen pistil interaction even in incompatible pollinations also to get desired hybrids. See, a breeder can cross different species, even with different genera also, to combine desirable characters to produce commercially superior varieties. Breeder can do that by the knowledge of this pollen pistil interaction. He can manipulate this pollen pistil interaction. Even it can like promote the incompatible pollinations also. See, why he used this process means in order to get commercially superior varieties. And this phenomena of producing superior varieties by combining the incompatible, by promoting the incompatible pollinations is known as artificial hybridization. It is one of the major approaches of crop improvement program. But in crossing experiments, it's very important that only the desired pollen grains are used for pollination. See, in crop improvement program, the crossing experiments, during crossing experiments, we want desirable pollen grains to fall on the stigma in order to get commercially very rich crop products. So in order to do that, while doing crossing experiments, it's very important that only the desired pollen grains has to be fall on the stigma, right? But the stigma has to be protected from contamination. Otherwise, all pollen grains will fall on the stigma. Maybe it's a compatible one. It can promote like post pollination events also. So in order to do that, so in order to protect the stigma from contamination, they will do different phenomena, right? So this one is called emasculation. This is called what? Emasculation. Here I will write. It's emasculation. See, if you observe emasculation, see, in this flower, both anthers and the stigma are present. This is a bisexual flower, right? So, see the plant breeder, right? If you observe that, he carefully removes the anthers from the flower. This is called emasculation, removing the anthers by the forceps in order to protect the stigma from contamination. See, there are many chances for self-pollination here because pollen grains and stigma are present on the same plant. So that is called contamination for a plant breeder. Artificial hybridization, this self-pollination is termed as contamination. So in order to prevent contamination, the plant breeder will go for emasculation. What do you mean by emasculation? Removing the anthers by the forceps, carefully removing the anthers by the forceps. Only now stigma is there. This phenomena is known as emasculation. See, if the stigma is not mature, then what he will do is, he will do bagging. See here, bagging. After removing, see, he has covered the stigma with a bag in order to prevent the contamination. After removing the stamens, he covered the stigma with the bag. This process we called it as bagging. See, bagging, there are some properties for doing bagging. Like bagging, suitable size, the cover size will be suitable. That is when comparable to the size of the stigma, the bagging cover should be in suitable size, and generally the paper is a butter paper. The paper which is used to cover the stigma is a butter paper. Right. When the stigma receives it gains the receptivity, suitable pollen grains should transfer on this flower, and again you have to bag the plant, which ensures the post pollination events and development of fruit will takes place. So this phenomena, emasculation and bagging, will be done by the artificial, will be done in artificial hybridization or artificial, we call this process as artificial hybridization methods. Emasculation and bagging takes place. In case of bisexual flowers, both emasculation and bagging takes place, right? But in case of the unisexual flowers, only female flower or male flower will be present. So only bagging takes place. We'll cover the stigma with a bag. Whenever the stigma reaches the receptivity, it can able to like pollen pistil interaction stage it reaches, then suitable pollen grains will like transfer to the stigma, which ensures fertilization. So these are some of the techniques of artificial hybridization, right? So this is about pollination, how it takes place in case of the seed plants, right? I hope you all like the video, right? Please subscribe to Easy Science YouTube channel.